Welcome to PSHS 6240, week 2 here at George Washington University, or week 3, I'm sorry. Just announcements, again, your paper is due next week, so I'll give an example here, but I just want to make sure that's cognizant due on the next Sunday at 11:59 p.m. So I want to give you an example paper. So what you'll see is a paper that was written that describes Hamas, and this was written before the October 7th attacks, as a terrorist group. So go ahead, pause me, and watch that video that I included in this announcement. Okay, so welcome back. Again, to emphasize for that paper, look at the criteria for why you think a group is terrorism, why a group is not. And even though I didn't put it in, I will let you use the October 7th attacks as another example if you want to write your paper on that Hamas is terrorism or it's not terrorism. But again, I want to emphasize, you come up with the criteria, 2, 3, or 3 points, and drive them forth. Here are some of the criteria. I don't want you to use all of them. Again, argument points or criteria I want you to emphasize. Here are some, but I don't want you to use all of them. Again, pick and choose what's applicable to what you want to write on. So, military versus non-military. Many of you brought this up when you talked about Fort Hood, or the Pentagon, or the USS Cole. Those were clearly military targets. The argument is, well, if it's military, it shouldn't be terrorism. But terrorist attacks are focused mainly on civilians. Yet we think about the USS Cole and the Pentagon and the Hezbollah Beirut bombings as terrorists. I'll let you decide. Many people will say no, a military target cannot be terrorism because it's a military target. Combatant versus non-combatant. This is a little bit, I didn't think about this when I first started the course, but many people have brought this up that, yeah, Fort Hood might have been a military target, but those people were not combatants. Those were civilians who were killed by Nidal Hasan. Or those people in the Pentagon were non-combatants. They were civilians. But are they non-combatants? At Fort Hood, those people were preparing soldiers to go off to war. And they were facilitating war-like operations. Even though they were civilians, really hard to say whether they're, you could certainly make the case that they're combatants. Same with the people in the Pentagon. I will let you decide one way or another. But certainly, if someone's a non-combatant, it's more likely to be a case of terrorism. State versus non-state. Again, many of you brought this up, and I brought it up a little bit in the lecture. A state-based entity we consider less likely to be a terrorist act. When we talked about the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Dresden, well, they might have killed a lot of civilians, but it was a state-based entity. In order to be terrorism, it has to be a non-state entity. Or does it? And again, when we say non-state entity, is Hezbollah a non-state entity, even though they get significant funding from the Iranians? Is the Pakistani terrorist groups, Lashkar-e-Taiba, the TTP, Tehrik-e-Taliban, are those non-state actors? I mean, those are really adjuncts of the Pakistani intelligence service. So, what is a state actor? What is a non-state actor? Does a state actor be absolved from being called terrorist, even though state actors have killed thousands of people? Is Hamas a state actor? I would probably say no, but many people made the argument that they're an adjunct of Iran because of the funding they get, or the Houthis, a terrorist group. Again, I'll let you decide. And again, as I mentioned, you have to make those distinctions in your paper. Targeting within or outside the locus of conflict. If we're going to use the Hamas argument, you can make the argument, I'll let you decide, that when Hamas targets or Palestinians target settlers in the West Bank or in Gaza, that's not terrorism because that is the locus of conflict. But Hamas went into a terrorist group when they crossed the line and it killed people in villages and kibbutz in Israel. That's outside the locus of conflict. I will let you decide what's in and outside the locus of conflict. But again, the FLN, to use that argument, they focused against, in Algeria, their terrorism focused against the people within Algeria itself. If they had crossed the line and started to bomb cafes in Paris and Marseille and Toulon, would they be a terrorist group instead of focusing on the locus of conflict? Again, I'll let you decide one way or another. Attacking the apparatus of government, as I mentioned in the lecture, Mandela. Not many people think he's a terrorist right now, and the question is why. And one of the reasons is there's two big reasons. One is that the apartheid regime was so awful that certain actions were acceptable. That's number one. Number two, Mandela didn't kill random civilians. He focused on the apparatus of oppression, the police and government officials that were engaged in apartheid. That made it less of a terrorist act. I will let you decide. Many people at the time thought Mandela was a terrorist. But I'll give you, again, argue it one way or another. War zone versus non-war zone. Another kind of goes along with the locus of conflict. Many of you said a IED attack was in a war zone. Therefore, it's not terrorism because it was in a war area. Well, who defines the war zone? If you're the enemy and you target Fort Hood like Nadal Hassan did, well, that's part of the war zone from the enemy perspective. Likewise, if you're bombing an IED, well, you say it's a war zone, but if I planted that IED in the ground and then I went back to my house, I'm outside the war zone. That little road is the war zone. Again, I'll let you decide. Many of you said the USS Cole was terrorism because it was outside a war zone. Well, again, that's the United States defining it as a war zone. If you're a villager in Yemen and a big naval ship comes on your in your neighborhood, you're going to say, well, maybe I'm in a war zone and I may have a right to target those that are part of that. Again, I will let you decide. A political narrative. This often says what is a insurgency versus terrorism versus criminal activity. A terrorist, as opposed to a random shooter, is going to have a political narrative. Arguably, again, the Columbine shooter did not have a political narrative, but the shooter in Charleston who killed 10 African Americans at the church had white supremacist ideologies. The person that killed in Buffalo against the shopping center that wanted to kill all African Americans, he had a political narrative. That's separate from some of these other random shooters. Levels of oppression. This goes along with the Mandela argument I just talked about. Arguably, again, the ANC or the apartheid regime was so bad that certain measures, violent measures, were okay. And that's one argument. That's maybe one of the reasons why we celebrate Mandela. For the last 40 years. Many have made the argument that the Hamas October 7th attack was acceptable because of Israeli oppression of Gaza. And I'm not going to necessarily agree with that, but that is one argument people have made. The people that are protesting in the streets, that certain actions on October 7th were acceptable because the Israelis had oppressed the Hamas leadership or oppressed the Palestinians so bad. Again, I'll let you decide one way or another. But again, certain people who are oppressed in a way and engage in violent acts to defeat that oppression, it's hard to say it's terrorism. If the Uyghurs in China targeted the People's Republic of China, the government, would that be terrorism? If they targeted civilians, would that be terrorism? I'll let you decide. Politically popular versus non-popular. This is kind of what separates an insurgency from a terrorist group. Insurgency tends to have some sort of political popularity. The Taliban had some political base. And you can make the argument they're not terrorism, while Al-Qaeda did not have that political base. And therefore, they're more of a terrorist group. Again, I'll let you decide. Degree of association. This comes up a lot. Fort Hood, many of you said he was associated with terrorism. He was associated with Anwar al-Awlaki, a known terrorist. Therefore, he's a terrorist by that association. Okay, but he didn't plan. It wasn't a planning relationship. It was more like a fanboy relationship. Does that make him terrorist or associated with terrorism? The Orlando shooter in 2016, he pledged, he didn't have an ongoing relationship with ISIS, but he pledged allegiance to ISIS afterward. Does that make him a terrorist? If I'm inspired by right-wing extremists, I might not be associated, I might not be planning that, but does that association now make the actions I do next terrorism? Again, I'll let you decide. Mental illness, again, many of you have said you go one way or another. Several of these terrorist activities, whether it's Orlando or in other situations, there was mental illness involved. Does that make it nullify terrorism? If you're mentally ill, can you not engage in some of the political violence? Or can you still be mentally ill and still be a terrorist? Again, I'll let you decide going forward. And then the tool of the oppressed, I kind of covered that earlier. So, again, in your paper, I want an intro, argument, rebuttal, and then policy recommendations. Real simple format. And again, just to bring some illustrative examples to really hammer this point. The Irgun, arguably highly oppressed, focused on the apparatus of oppression, many of their terrorist acts, and it was within the Algerian locus of conflict. That would make them less of a terrorist. And you saw the videos, they don't, they would never say, they would never say they were terrorism. I'm sorry, the Irgun is in Israel. Again, highly oppressed after the Holocaust, focused on the apparatus of oppression, the British, within the locus of conflict. So is that terrorism? Again, the guy in the video would say no. The FLN, as you saw in the video, highly oppressed by the French, arguably, focused on civilians, again, and they killed a lot of civilians, did some nasty things, but it was within the locus of conflict in Algeria. Some people say, yes, that's terrorism. They killed civilians. They were brutal people, and they should be labeled as terrorists. They would argue, as the guy in the video did, Ben Bella, no, we were oppressed. The French had everything. We had to do it, and we didn't kill civilians in Paris or Toulon. We killed people who were in the locus of conflict. Al-Qaeda, as a contrast, not really oppressed. Their arguments pre-9/11 were the American occupation of Saudi Arabia. They killed civilians, and then they obviously killed civilians in New York and Washington and other areas. That would, in the spectrum there, make it more likely to be labeled as terrorism. So I've given you a lot of criteria here. Don't choose everyone. Just focus your paper. Many of you had a good start in the discussion, and I look forward to your papers next week. And unfortunately in this class, I can't just give you the week to do the papers. We've got to go on with terrorism history, the road to 9/11. And what I want you to think through is the social, political, demographics, and historical and cultural factors that have led to the road to 9/11, the rise of ISIS, the Israel-Palestinian conference, the road to October 7th. Even though that video was made before October 7th, it's still applicable to try and explain what is going on in the Arab or the Israeli-Hamas conflict that we're seeing now. So, with that being said, I look forward to your papers. If there's questions or issues, don't hesitate to contact me, and I'll see you on the discussion boards this week.